The soft glow of the chandelier cast delicate patterns of light on the polished wooden floor, creating fleeting reflections in the otherwise silent house. Eleanor stood by the large window, her gaze fixed on the dimly lit garden outside. The roses she had once tended with care now lay wilting in the shadows, their lifeless state mirroring the turmoil and emptiness in her own heart. The clock on the wall ticked in slow, steady beats, but each sound reverberated through the stillness like the heavy thud of a pulse that could not be ignored. The quiet creak of the living room door broke her reverie. Footsteps echoed softly but purposefully, pulling Eleanor back to the present. It was Matthew. He appeared in the doorway, his rolled-up shirt sleeves revealing forearms that carried an ease and confidence, yet there was something unplaceable in his sharp eyes, something familiar, but distant. "I thought everyone had gone to bed," he said, his voice low and cautious, though his expression betrayed a hint of surprise at seeing Eleanor still standing there, her lips curved in a faint, unreadable smile. "And you? Why aren't you asleep?" Eleanor asked, her tone light as a breeze, though a flicker of curiosity gleamed in her eyes. Matthew held her gaze for a moment longer than expected before replying, "I saw the living room light was on and thought someone might be up. So I came to check." Eleanor turned away, walking toward the large dining table where bottles of wine were neatly arranged. She poured herself a glass, the amber liquid catching the light like molten gold. "If you can't sleep, join me," she offered, gesturing with the glass. "A little wine can help calm restless thoughts." Matthew hesitated, his steps slow and deliberate, before he took the glass she handed him. "It's so quiet tonight, isn't it?" she mused aloud, more to herself than to him. "Quiet, yes. But sometimes the quiet feels unsettling," Matthew replied, his tone hovering between honesty and jest. His eyes, however, inadvertently locked onto hers. There was something in the way he looked at her that sent a shiver down Eleanor's spine. That gaze, intense, searching, was not the look of a nephew toward his aunt, however distant the familial tie might be. The silence between them stretched taut, filled only by the faint hum of the house and the soft whistle of wind through the cracks in the windows. Eleanor felt an unspoken tension in the air, not danger exactly, but something indefinable, like the faint flicker of a flame newly born from dormant embers. Sensing the shift, Matthew placed his glass down on the table, his movements careful, almost cautious, before he broke the moment with a quiet chuckle. "I don't want to disturb you. Maybe I should—" "Matthew." Eleanor's voice stopped him mid-sentence, cutting through the air like a sharp blade. He froze, turning back to face her. "You don't have to feel uncomfortable," she said softly. "This house has been cold and quiet for a long time. Sometimes, I'm not even sure if I belong in it anymore." Matthew didn't respond immediately. He simply looked at her, his gaze probing, as if searching for meaning behind her words. Eleanor turned away, hiding the faint, wistful smile that tugged at her lips. "Go ahead," she said after a moment, her voice quieter now. "Go get some rest. I should head upstairs too." But as Eleanor turned and began ascending the staircase, she felt his eyes lingering on her, following her every step. It wasn't an indifferent gaze. It wasn't empty or detached. It held something deeper, something unreadable, like the quiet but persistent swell of an undercurrent preparing to surge. Her steps up the staircase felt heavier with each passing moment. When she reached the door to her bedroom, she paused, her trembling fingers brushing the cold brass of the doorknob. Matthew's gaze still burned vividly in her mind, like a small flame melting through the layers of ice that had encased her heart for so long. She took a deep, steadying breath before pushing the door open, closing it softly behind her, shutting herself away from the thoughts that now swirled chaotically within her. In the vast, dimly lit bedroom, the soft glow of the bedside lamp cast faint shadows on the empty walls and crookedly hung photographs, remnants of a past that once seemed filled with happiness, but now stood as silent witnesses to emptiness. Eleanor sat in a worn armchair by the window, her fingers absent-mindedly tracing the edge of an old necklace, a gift from Max on their first anniversary. The heart-shaped pendant, once gleaming and vibrant, had tarnished over time, much like the love it symbolized, now dulled and lifeless. In the beginning, her sacrifice felt worthwhile. They spent weekends strolling along the shores of Lake Michigan, shared intimate dinners, and dreamed up plans for their future. But as Max's career consumed more of his time, their romantic evenings turned into lonely meals for one. Their walks disappeared, and their promises were replaced by late-night meetings and endless phone calls. Max no longer looked at Eleanor as the woman he once loved, but as a fixture in his life, a presence he had grown accustomed to but no longer cherished. She tried to fight for their connection. She dressed up, wearing the dresses he used to compliment, prepared elaborate meals he once praised. But every evening, Max would step through the door, nod absent-mindedly, glance at his phone, and mutter a distracted thanks before immersing himself in work. Eleanor realized she was no longer his partner, no longer the vibrant woman he once adored. She had become a beautiful but forgotten ornament in his carefully constructed world. The memory of one particular evening remained vivid in her mind, a night when she gathered every ounce of courage to address the loneliness that had taken root in her heart. "We need to talk," she had said, her voice trembling. Max barely looked up from his laptop, his expression fatigued and impatient. "Eleanor, please don't make this complicated. I'm really busy right now. Everything's fine, isn't it?" His words were not just dismissive. They were a sharp blade cutting through the last thread of hope she had clung to. But what hurt Eleanor most wasn't Max's indifference. It was the realization that she had lost herself. How long had it been since she held a paintbrush? Since she felt the freedom of pouring her soul onto a canvas? In the mirror, she no longer recognized the woman who once captivated Max, who inspired admiration for her confidence and passion. Instead, she saw a faded reflection, a shadow of her former self, desperately holding together the facade of a marriage that had already fractured. The gentle whisper of wind against the windowpane pulled Eleanor from her sorrowful reverie. She looked out at the dark garden below, where the roses she once nurtured had withered into brittle stems. Her fingers tightened around the necklace, as though clinging to the last piece of a fading memory. But even this small token seemed devoid of meaning now. A sudden thought struck her like a pang in her chest. Had she, all along, been the one to bury herself? Eleanor rose from her chair and walked toward the dusty easel in the corner of the room. Her hand trembled as she touched the worn wooden frame, her fingertips brushing against the echoes of days when she poured her heart into her art. She wanted to pick up a brush, to feel that rush of life surging through her veins again, but an invisible weight held her back. Was it too late to start over? As she caught her reflection in the glass of the window, she couldn't ignore what stared back at her. Her eyes, once brimming with hope and determination, now held only the shadows of longing and defeat. And perhaps that was why, when Matthew entered her life with his youthful gaze, sparkling with attention and curiosity, she couldn't resist the intoxicating pull of being seen, of being wanted again. What Eleanor couldn't yet know was that this yearning, this desire to feel alive, would lead her into a whirlwind she never anticipated. Matthew's footsteps echoed softly through the quiet house as Eleanor busied herself in the dimly lit studio. The golden glow of the desk lamp cast a warm light over the empty canvas she had just brushed clean of months-old dust. Her heart was restless, caught between the guilt of letting herself grow weak in Matthew's presence and the undeniable surge of vitality she felt whenever he was near. "You're still up this late?" Matthew's voice came from the doorway, deep and warm, tinged with hesitation. Eleanor looked up, her eyes meeting his bright, steady gaze. He stood there, holding 2 cups of steaming tea, a faint smile playing on his lips as if he had already rehearsed his reason for lingering. "I thought you might need something warm," he added, stepping into the room and setting one of the cups on the small table beside her. "Thank you, but you really should be getting some rest," Eleanor replied. Her voice, however, lacked its usual sharpness. Instead, it carried a softness, a subtle tension, as if each word she spoke was tinged with emotions she couldn't name. Matthew pulled a chair closer and sat across from her, his eyes quietly observing her every movement. "Can't sleep? You look tired," he asked, his voice gentle but filled with genuine concern. Eleanor paused, her fingers lightly brushing the edge of the canvas. "I'm just not used to the silence," she answered, her gaze drifting into the distance. "This house is so big, and sometimes it feels like I'm living in a mausoleum. There's no one to hear me, no one to talk to." Matthew said nothing, his gaze calm and patient, as though waiting for her to continue. "You wouldn't understand," she added, a faint, bitter smile tugging at her lips. "When I was younger, I thought love was everything. I believed that if I gave enough of myself, sacrificed enough, things would turn out fine. But then I realized, love doesn't always get returned in the way you expect." "You shouldn't have to feel that way," Matthew interjected, his voice suddenly deeper, more resolute. Eleanor looked up, startled by his tone. "I mean, you're special, Eleanor. Anyone who's around you should see that and cherish it." His eyes locked onto hers, and for a moment the space between them felt impossibly small. Eleanor laughed softly, but there was a nervous edge to her voice, a mixture of disbelief and defense. "You're too young to understand these things, Matthew. Life isn't that simple." "Maybe I am young," Matthew admitted, his gaze steady. "But I know what loneliness feels like. And I know what it's like to want someone to understand you, but not be able to say it out loud. I see it in you, every time you're quiet, every time your eyes drift off like they're carrying the weight of 1,000 thoughts." Matthew's words struck Eleanor like a lightning bolt, leaving her breathless. She hadn't expected someone so young to see through the carefully constructed walls she had built around herself, to unearth the emotions she had buried for so long. The air in the room grew heavier, and Eleanor's breathing quickened, as though every word Matthew spoke had reached the deepest part of her, the part even she was afraid to acknowledge. "You should go to bed, Matthew," she finally managed, her voice trembling as she tried to regain composure. "I need some time alone." Matthew rose from his seat, but he didn't leave immediately. Instead, he walked toward Eleanor, his steps slow and deliberate, as if he were searching for permission or a sign. "Eleanor," he murmured, her name falling from his lips like a whisper. She looked up at him, and when their eyes met, the barriers she had clung to seemed to dissolve in an instant. Matthew leaned down, his face close to hers, so close she could feel his breath. "If this is wrong, I'm sorry," he said, his voice soft but unwavering. He didn't break eye contact, and before Eleanor could respond, he pressed a gentle kiss to her lips, a hesitant question, an unspoken plea. Eleanor froze, her heart pounding so fiercely she could hardly breathe. She should have pushed him away, should have told him that this was a mistake. But instead, her hands loosened, her defenses crumbled. When Matthew pulled back, his eyes filled with uncertainty, she stared at him for a moment that felt like an eternity. Then, without a word, she reached for him, pulling him closer, their lips meeting again, this time with passion, without hesitation. She didn't know. All she knew was that the days ahead would be anything but peaceful. The soft morning sunlight filtered through the curtains, casting a gentle glow across the room. Eleanor sat silently on the edge of the bed, her gaze fixed on the small suitcase resting at her feet. Her breathing was steady but heavy, each inhale and exhale weighted with the burden of decisions made and the uncertainty of what lay ahead. Beside the suitcase stood the last painting she had ever started, a canvas marked by bold, expressive strokes that conveyed deep emotion but remained unfinished. It mirrored her own life, a story without a clear ending. A faint knock at the door startled her, pulling her from her thoughts. "Come in," she said quietly, her voice tinged with a slight tremor. The door creaked open, and Ethan stepped inside. He paused in the doorway, his eyes filled with concern but also quiet acceptance. In his hand was a steaming cup of coffee. He said nothing as he approached, setting the cup on the small table beside her suitcase. "Are you sure about this?" Ethan finally asked, his voice low and careful, as if afraid of shattering the fragile atmosphere in the room. Eleanor looked up at him, her expression calm yet resolute. "I'm not sure about anything, Ethan. But I know I can't stay here any longer. If I do, I'll destroy myself, and everyone around me. Maybe it's time for me to find myself again." Ethan lowered himself into the chair across from her, his hands clasped together, his brows furrowed as though weighing his words. "I understand, Eleanor. But I also know that leaving won't solve everything. Max, Matthew, even me. We're all going to be affected by this decision." He paused, his gaze studying her face as though searching for unspoken answers. "Have you said goodbye to Matthew?" The question hit Eleanor like a sharp needle piercing her heart. She turned away, avoiding his eyes, though the pain in her chest swelled. Last night, she and Matthew had exchanged their final words, if they could even be called that. He had stood silently in the studio as she told him about her decision to leave. There were no pleas, no accusations, just the look in his eyes, filled with pain and loss he couldn't hide. "I understand," Matthew had said, his voice low and trembling. "You have to do this. I don't want you to live without happiness, even if it means you have to leave me." His words still echoed in her mind, making her feel as though she were teetering on the edge of a cliff, one step away from falling into an endless void. Ethan sighed when Eleanor remained silent, his worry evident. Rising to his feet, he placed a firm yet gentle hand on her shoulder. His eyes held a mix of sadness and resolve. "I won't stop you, Eleanor. But I want you to remember, leaving isn't always the only solution. Sometimes staying and facing things head-on is the only way to truly move forward." Eleanor lifted her gaze to meet his, her eyes filled with gratitude but also an unshakable determination. "Thank you, Ethan. Thank you for always being there for me, even when I don't deserve it. But this time, I have to go. Not to run away, but to rediscover who I am." Ethan nodded slowly, his hand slipping away as though he understood that no words could change her resolve. "I'll always be here if you need me," he said softly, before turning and walking out, leaving Eleanor alone with her thoughts. She stood, her hands trembling as she pulled the zipper closed on her suitcase. A light breeze drifted in through the window, rustling the thin curtains and carrying the faint scent of roses from the garden outside. Eleanor grabbed the suitcase and stepped out of her room, her heels clicking softly on the wooden floor as she walked down the long hallway. The family photos hung on the walls seemed to watch her as she passed, silent witnesses to the life she was leaving behind. She paused outside Matthew's door. A sliver of light spilled into the hallway from the gap beneath it, a sign he was still awake. Her hand hovered in the air, poised to knock, but she hesitated. She wasn't sure if there was anything left to say, or if any words could change what had already been set into motion. Instead, she let her hand fall, turned, and continued walking. When she opened the front door, the early morning sunlight flooded in, making her squint. The taxi waited at the gate, its engine idling softly. Eleanor stepped outside, the sound of her heels tapping against the stone path echoing faintly in the crisp air. She climbed into the car and just before closing the door, glanced back one last time. The house stood silent and still, like a monument to the life she was leaving behind. But she knew the people inside, Max, Ethan, Matthew, would forever remain a part of her story, indelibly etched into the fabric of who she was. The taxi began to move, carrying her away from the past and toward an uncertain future. Eleanor gazed out the window, her eyes reflecting a faint sadness, but also a glimmer of hope. She didn't know where the road ahead would take her, but for the first time in years she felt as though she was walking her own path. And somewhere deep in her heart, she knew that nothing was truly ending. It was only the beginning.